February 19, 1945, dawn. Tony Stein hit the black volcanic beach of Iwo Jima carrying a weapon that wasn't supposed to exist. It looked like someone had taken a machine gun apart and put it back together wrong, cobbling together pieces from different weapons into something that shouldn't work but did. The barrel came from an aircraft machine gun, the stock came from a rifle, the bipod came from a different machine gun. The trigger mechanism was homemade. The whole thing looked like a fever dream of spare parts held together by determination and engineering skill. But when Tony pulled the trigger, the stinger roared to life with a rate of fire that made normal machine guns sound like they were shooting in slow motion, 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute, 3 times faster than the weapons the Japanese were using against him. They had never heard anything like it. Tony was 23 years old, a Jewish kid from Dayton, Ohio, who had worked as a toolmaker before the war. He had helped build this weapon himself from the wreckage of a crashed dive bomber. Now he was about to use it to save the lives of everyone in his unit. He just had to survive the next few hours first. Anthony Michael Stein was born September 30th, 1921 in Dayton, Ohio, to parents who had fled Europe to escape the anti-Semitism that was making life increasingly difficult for Jews in Austria-Hungary. His father, Steve, originally called Istvan, and his mother, Rose Brandulek, had immigrated from Erdevik, a small town that would eventually become part of Yugoslavia and then Serbia after multiple border changes following World War I. They arrived in America looking for the same thing millions of other immigrants sought, a place where their children could grow up without fear, where being Jewish wouldn't limit opportunities, where hard work could build a decent life. They settled in Dayton because it was an industrial city with jobs for people willing to work with their hands, and they raised their son in a working-class neighborhood where most families had similar immigration stories, where everyone's parents or grandparents had come from somewhere else seeking something better. Tony attended Kaiser High School in Dayton, but he wasn't particularly interested in academics. He was more interested in how things worked, in taking machinery apart and putting it back together, in understanding the mechanical principles that made engines run and tools function. When he was old enough to leave school legally, he dropped out and took a job as a tool and die maker, working in a machine shop at Dayton Patterson Field, where he learned the precise metalworking skills that would later prove crucial on a Pacific island 8,000 miles from home. Tool and die making is specialized work requiring patience, precision, and an intuitive understanding of how metal behaves under stress, how tolerances matter when parts need to fit together perfectly, how small modifications can change how a mechanism functions. Tony was good at it. He had the kind of hands that could feel when something was right, when dimensions matched specifications, when a piece would work the way it was supposed to work. The world Tony grew up in during the 1920s and 1930s was one where anti-Semitism existed in America too, more subtle than in Europe perhaps, but still present in quotas limiting Jewish enrollment at universities, in neighborhoods where Jews weren't welcome, in jobs that wouldn't hire them regardless of qualifications. Tony's parents had fled one form of prejudice only to encounter another, milder version in their new home, but they had also found opportunities that wouldn't have existed in Europe, and they raised their son to appreciate those opportunities while never forgetting where they came from or what they had escaped. When war broke out in Europe in 1939 and reports began filtering back about what the Nazis were doing to Jews, the Stein family understood in their bones what was happening because they had left the same region where these horrors were now unfolding. They knew people who had stayed behind. They understood that their decision to immigrate had quite possibly saved their lives. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Tony was 20 years old, working his tool-making job, living with his parents in Dayton. The attack transformed America overnight, from a nation trying to stay out of the European war to a nation mobilizing for global conflict. And young men across the country rushed to enlist before they could be drafted, wanting to choose their service rather than being assigned wherever the military needed bodies. Tony waited almost a year before enlisting, perhaps thinking about whether he really wanted to go, perhaps finishing work commitments, perhaps trying to decide which branch of service made the most sense. On September 22, 1942, he walked into a Marine Corps recruiting office and signed the papers that would take him from the relative safety of an Ohio machine shop to the most brutal combat of the Pacific War. He didn't choose the Marines because it was easy. He chose them because he knew they were sent into battle first, because he wanted to be where the fighting was hardest, because somewhere in his personality there was something that needed to prove itself in the most extreme circumstances possible. The Marines accepted him and sent him to recruit training, the brutal process of breaking down civilians and rebuilding them as Marines, teaching them to follow orders instantly, to function under stress, to endure physical hardship without complaint. Tony completed recruit training and was selected for an elite unit called the Para-Marines, Marines who were trained to parachute behind enemy lines, a prestigious assignment that indicated his superiors recognized something in him beyond normal capabilities. The Para-Marines provided intensive training in everything from parachute operations to demolitions to small unit tactics, creating versatile fighters who could operate independently in hostile territory with minimal support. The Para-Marines saw limited action as parachute troops because the Pacific Island hopping campaign didn't provide many opportunities for airborne operations. But the training Tony received gave him skills and confidence that would serve him throughout his combat service. He fought in various campaigns in the Pacific, including Bougainville, where he demonstrated the deadly shooting skills that would later make him famous, reportedly killing 5 Japanese snipers in a single day through a combination of marksmanship and tactical awareness that allowed him to locate and eliminate threats before they could kill Marines. His performance in combat earned him promotion to corporal and recognition as a reliable, aggressive fighter who could be counted on when things got difficult. In 1944, the Para-Marines were disbanded as a separate organization, and their members were reassigned to regular Marine units that needed experienced combat veterans for upcoming operations. Tony was promoted to corporal and assigned as assistant squad leader to Company A, 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, in the newly formed 5th Marine Division that was being created specifically for the invasion of Iwo Jima. The division trained at Camp Pendleton in California, conducting amphibious landing exercises and live fire drills preparing for the kind of combat they would encounter on a heavily fortified island defended by thousands of Japanese troops who had months to prepare defensive positions. The Marines knew Iwo Jima would be brutal. Intelligence estimates predicted heavy casualties. Everyone in the division understood they were preparing for one of the hardest battles of the war. It was during this training period at Camp Pendleton that Tony met Sergeant Mel Grevich, an armorer with G Company who had been thinking about how to give Marines better firepower against Japanese fortifications. Grevich was frustrated with the existing machine guns available to Marine infantry, believing they didn't provide enough sustained fire to suppress well-defended pillboxes and bunkers. He remembered seeing wrecked American dive bombers on various Pacific islands, aircraft that had crashed and been left behind because salvaging them wasn't worth the effort. But those wrecks contained M2 Browning machine guns, aircraft weapons designed to fire at extremely high rates to maximize the chances of hitting fast-moving enemy planes. Grevich wondered if those aircraft guns could be adapted for ground combat, if the higher rate of fire could be useful against fortifications instead of aircraft. Working with Private First Class John Little and drawing on ideas other Marines had tried in previous campaigns, Grevich began experimenting with converting M2 aircraft machine guns into man-portable weapons that individual Marines could carry and fire. The M2 fired the same .30-06 ammunition as the M1 Garand rifle and the Browning automatic rifle, which meant ammo compatibility wouldn't be a problem, but the aircraft version had no stock, no sights designed for ground use, and no practical way to hold and aim it. Grevich's solution was to attach an M1 Garand wooden rifle stock to give the weapon something to brace against a shoulder. Add the bipod from a Browning automatic rifle to provide a stable platform when firing from prone position. Install bar rear sights so the shooter could actually aim at ground targets, and fabricate a custom trigger mechanism that would allow reliable firing without the electrical solenoid system the aircraft version used. The result was ugly, improvised, cobbled together from pieces that were never designed to work together. But when Grevich test-fired his prototype, it worked. The modified weapon, which someone nicknamed the Stinger because its high rate of fire had quite a sting, could fire between 1,200 and 1,500 rounds per minute compared to the 400-600 rounds per minute of standard M19-19 machine guns. The difference was dramatic. Where a normal machine gun fired in distinct bursts with audible gaps between individual rounds, the Stinger produced a continuous roar that sounded like fabric tearing, putting so many bullets down range so quickly that enemy positions couldn't survive sustained fire. The drawback was that the Stinger burned through ammunition in seconds, requiring frequent reloading, but Grevich believed the tactical advantages outweighed this limitation. When Tony Stein saw what Grevich had created, he immediately understood its potential. His toolmaking background gave him the technical knowledge to appreciate the engineering that had gone into adapting an aircraft weapon for ground use, and his combat experience told him that more firepower meant more dead Japanese and more live Marines. He volunteered to help Grevich build additional Stingers and to test them under field conditions. Working together at Camp Pendleton, Grevich and Tony built 6 complete Stingers before the 5th Marine Division shipped out for Iwo Jima. 5 of them were assigned to G Company, where Grevich served, distributed among the company's rifle platoons and demolition section. The 6th was given to Tony, the only Marine outside Grevich's company to receive one, a testament to the respect Grevich had for Tony's combat skills and his belief that Tony would use the weapon effectively. Tony trained with the Stinger obsessively during the weeks before the division shipped out, learning its quirks and capabilities, discovering that it had a tendency to jam if not properly maintained. Understanding that its high rate of fire meant he would need to carry extra ammunition, practicing quick magazine changes because running dry during combat would get him killed. He named his Stinger and treated it like a partner, cleaning and adjusting it until he knew every component intimately, until he could field strip and reassemble it blindfolded, until the weapon became an extension of himself rather than a tool he carried. The other Marines in his unit watched him training, and some of them thought the Stinger was a death sentence, too heavy to carry during an amphibious assault, too hungry for ammunition to be practical, too likely to jam at the worst possible moment. Tony ignored them. He knew what the Stinger could do, and he knew he would need every advantage when they hit the beach at Iwo Jima. The island of Iwo Jima is a small volcanic rock in the Pacific Ocean, roughly 8 square miles of black sand and stone dominated by Mount Suribachi on the southern tip. The Japanese had fortified it extensively because it sat directly along the flight path American B-29 bombers used when striking Japan from bases in the Marianas, and Japanese fighters based on Iwo could intercept those bombers while American fighters couldn't escort them because Iwo was beyond the range of American fighters based in the Marianas. If America captured Iwo, the B-29s could be escorted by fighters based on the island, casualties would drop, and damaged bombers would have an emergency landing field instead of ditching in the ocean. The Japanese understood this calculation perfectly, which is why they sent thousands of troops to Iwo and ordered them to fight to the death defending every foot of ground. The Japanese defensive strategy relied on fortifications rather than beach defenses. Instead of trying to stop the Marines at the waterline, where naval gunfire and aircraft could support the attackers, the Japanese built an elaborate network of bunkers, pillboxes, tunnels, and caves throughout the island, concentrating their forces inland where they could fight from prepared positions while the Marines had to cross open ground under fire. They built 11 miles of tunnels connecting defensive positions, allowing troops to move underground, reinforcing threatened areas without exposing themselves to American firepower. They positioned artillery and mortars on the reverse slopes of hills where American ships couldn't see them to return fire. They created interlocking fields of fire where every piece of open ground was covered by multiple machine guns, firing from concrete fortifications that could absorb hits from everything except direct hits from large-caliber weapons. The American plan called for the Marines to land on the southeast beaches, push inland to capture Suribachi, then sweep north across the island, securing airfields and destroying Japanese positions until organized resistance ended. Intelligence estimates suggested the island could be secured in 5 days. This was optimistic to the point of fantasy. The battle would actually take 36 days and become one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history, with casualty rates exceeding 50% in some units. Tony Stein and the 28th Marines would be in the first wave, hitting the beach directly below Mount Suribachi, the most heavily defended sector of the island. The night before the landing, Tony wrote letters to his family and cleaned his Stinger one more time, checking every component, loading fresh ammunition, preparing for the fight that would determine whether he lived or died. He was 23 years old. He had survived multiple combat campaigns. He knew what to expect when the landing craft hit the beach and the ramp dropped and Marines ran into machine gun fire. He knew some of his friends wouldn't survive tomorrow. He knew he might not survive tomorrow. But he also knew his job was to attack Japanese positions and kill Japanese soldiers before they could kill Marines. And the Stinger gave him the firepower to do that job better than anyone else in his company. He finished his letters, finished his preparations, and tried to sleep. February 19, 1945, 0900 hours. The landing craft hit the beach and the ramps dropped, and Tony Stein ran onto Iwo Jima carrying the Stinger, while Japanese artillery and mortar fire began dropping on the beach with lethal accuracy. The black volcanic sand made running difficult, offering poor footing that slowed everyone down, and Marines struggled inland while explosions erupted around them and machine gun fire swept across the beach from positions they couldn't see. Tony kept moving forward, getting clear of the waterline where Marines were most vulnerable. Finding cover, establishing a firing position, looking for targets. He was one of the first men from his company to get into position beyond the beach, which meant he was alone and exposed until the rest of his unit caught up. Japanese machine guns opened fire from pillboxes Tony couldn't locate by sight because they were designed to be nearly invisible. Firing through small openings in concrete fortifications covered with black volcanic sand that made them blend perfectly with the terrain. Tony did what he had been trained to do. He stood up fully exposed in plain view of the enemy, deliberately drawing their fire so he could see where the shots came from, using his body as bait to locate the Japanese positions. Bullets kicked up sand around him. Tracer rounds slashed past. He spotted the muzzle flash from a pillbox 50 yards ahead and dropped back into cover, having accomplished his mission. Now he knew where they were. He charged the pillbox, firing the Stinger from the hip, advancing while putting sustained fire into the firing port, 1,200 rounds per minute pouring into the small opening, suppressing the defenders, preventing them from firing back effectively. He reached the pillbox and emptied his remaining ammunition into it at point-blank range, killing everyone inside, then moved to the next position while the rest of his platoon advanced behind him, using the space he had cleared. Within the first hour, Tony attacked and destroyed multiple pillboxes using the same technique. Locate the position by drawing fire, advance while firing, destroy the fortification, move to the next target. His Stinger worked exactly as intended, providing overwhelming firepower that Japanese defenders couldn't match. But the Stinger's incredible rate of fire created a problem Tony had anticipated during training. He burned through ammunition faster than any other weapon in the company. A standard machine gun team carried thousands of rounds because the gunner fired in short controlled bursts, conserving ammunition while maintaining suppressive fire. Tony couldn't fire controlled bursts without negating the Stinger's main advantage, which meant he needed to sustain fire until targets were destroyed, which meant he went through magazines in seconds and needed constant resupply. He ran out of ammunition after his first few engagements and realized he had to go back to the beach to get more because the unit's ammunition bearers couldn't keep up with his consumption rate. So Tony ran back to the beach through ongoing artillery fire and machine gun fire that was still sweeping across the landing zone, found the ammunition dump where supplies were being unloaded, grabbed fresh magazines, and ran back to his position carrying as much as he could physically handle. Then he resumed attacking pillboxes. Then he ran out of ammunition again. Then he made another run to the beach, and another, and another. He made 8 separate trips back to the beach that day, running through some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth, while Japanese artillery and machine gun fire killed Marines all around him, refusing to stop fighting because his unit needed him to keep destroying Japanese positions so they could advance. Somewhere during those trips, Tony made a calculation about speed and survival. He was wearing his M1 helmet and his combat boots, standard Marine Corps issue, required equipment that every Marine wore into combat. But the helmet added weight and affected his peripheral vision, and the boots were slowing him down in the volcanic sand that filled them and made running harder. Tony decided that speed mattered more than protection. He took off his helmet and threw it aside. He kicked off his boots and threw them aside. He made his subsequent ammunition runs barefoot and bareheaded, running faster without the weight, accepting the increased vulnerability, because getting ammunition to the front line faster meant more Japanese positions destroyed before they could kill more Marines. Each time Tony ran back to the beach, he looked for wounded Marines who were trying to get to the aid station or who were immobilized by their injuries. The beach was supposed to be where casualties were evacuated and treated, but the beach was also under constant fire, and reaching it didn't guarantee safety. Tony began carrying wounded Marines on his back during his return trips, one man per trip, getting them closer to medical help while simultaneously resupplying himself with ammunition. The physical effort of carrying a grown man across volcanic sand while under fire, then returning to combat and engaging in sustained firefights, then making another ammunition run, then carrying another casualty, required endurance beyond normal human capabilities. Tony did it 8 times. He saved 8 men's lives while simultaneously destroying multiple Japanese positions. No one asked him to do this. It wasn't part of his assigned mission. He did it because Marines were dying and he could help them. The Stinger itself became a target during the fighting. Japanese troops understood that the weapon producing that distinctive high-rate roar was causing them tremendous casualties, and they concentrated fire on Tony whenever they could locate him. Twice during the day, Japanese bullets hit the Stinger while Tony was firing it, knocking the weapon out of his hands, sending it flying while Tony dove for cover. Both times he retrieved the damaged weapon, checked it for functionality, found it still operational, and resumed fighting. The fact that the Stinger could take multiple direct hits from enemy fire and continue functioning demonstrated the robust construction Grevich had engineered into the weapon, but it also demonstrated Tony's commitment to using it regardless of personal risk. By the end of February 19th, Tony Stein had personally killed at least 20 Japanese soldiers, destroyed numerous pillboxes and firing positions, made 8 ammunition runs under fire while carrying wounded Marines, and helped his company establish positions beyond the beach that would allow the advance to continue the next day. His actions that day would later be recognized with the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, presented for valor above and beyond the call of duty. But Tony didn't know that as the first day of the battle ended and Marines dug into defensive positions for the night, preparing for Japanese counterattacks that everyone expected would come. He just knew he had survived, and his unit had advanced, and the Stinger had done exactly what it was designed to do. The 28th Marines continued fighting over the next several days, advancing toward Mount Suribachi while taking casualties from Japanese positions that had to be destroyed one by one through close combat and demolitions. Tony continued using his Stinger with deadly effectiveness, becoming known throughout the regiment as the Marine with the aircraft gun who fought like a demon. On February 23rd, the 28th Marines reached the summit of Mount Suribachi and raised the American flag in one of the most iconic moments of the war, a photograph captured by Joe Rosenthal that would become the defining image of American sacrifice and determination. Tony wasn't there when the flag went up because he had been wounded during the fighting around Suribachi and evacuated to a hospital ship offshore. His wounds weren't life-threatening, but they were serious enough that medical personnel wanted him to remain aboard ship recovering. Tony had done his part. He had earned his Medal of Honor. He had killed more Japanese soldiers than most Marines would encounter in an entire campaign. He could have stayed on the hospital ship and no one would have questioned his courage or his dedication. But Tony heard that his regiment was taking heavy casualties at Hill 362A in the northern part of the island, that the fighting had become even more brutal than the initial landing, that Marines were dying trying to take ground that the Japanese defended with suicidal determination. He left the hospital ship against medical advice and returned to his unit, unwilling to remain safe while his friends were fighting and dying. On March 1, 1945, 11 days after landing on Iwo Jima, 10 days after earning the Medal of Honor, Corporal Tony Stein was leading a 19-man patrol attempting to locate a Japanese machine gun emplacement that had Company A pinned down. The patrol moved carefully through terrain riddled with tunnels and concealed positions, knowing that Japanese snipers and hidden machine guns could open fire at any moment. Tony was at the front of the patrol because that was where squad leaders went. Because someone had to be first, because that was the job. A Japanese sniper, hidden in a position the patrol couldn't see, aimed carefully and fired once. The bullet killed Tony Stein instantly. He was 23 years old. He had been in combat for 11 days on Iwo Jima and approximately 10 days total throughout his entire service in the Pacific. His body was recovered and buried temporarily in the 5th Division Cemetery on Iwo Jima, grave number 1107, row 6, plot 5. The battle for Iwo Jima continued for another 3 weeks after Tony's death, finally ending on March 26th when the island was declared secure. The cost was staggering. Nearly 7,000 Americans killed and 19,000 wounded out of a landing force of approximately 70,000. Almost all 22,000 Japanese defenders were killed. The casualty rate exceeded 50% in some Marine units, making it one of the bloodiest battles in American military history. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than any other battle in American history. Tony Stein was one of those 27, the only one who fought with a homemade weapon cobbled together from aircraft parts. On February 19, 1946, exactly 1 year after Tony landed on Iwo Jima, his Medal of Honor was presented to his widow in a ceremony at the Ohio State House, conducted by Ohio Governor Frank Lauscher. Admiral Richard Penoyer placed the medal around her neck while she stood between pride and grief, accepting recognition of what her husband had done while knowing that no medal could replace him. Tony's mother Rose attended the ceremony, watching with tears streaming down her face as her son was honored posthumously, carrying the weight of having fled Europe to give her son a better life only to lose him in a war halfway around the world. Tony had married before shipping out to Iwo Jima, a quick wartime marriage to a woman he loved but didn't have much time with before deployment sent him to the Pacific. His widow remarried in 1947, moving on with her life as widows must. But this created complications when Tony's remains were repatriated from Iwo Jima in 1948, and the question arose of where he should be buried. His widow wanted him buried in the Catholic cemetery associated with her church, Our Lady of Rosary, in accordance with the religious conversion Tony had undergone before their marriage. His mother wanted him buried in a Jewish cemetery, honoring the faith he was born into and the heritage his parents had carried from Europe to America. The conflict was painful and public. Two women who loved Tony fighting over his body, each believing she knew what he would have wanted. Military regulations gave the widow priority as next of kin, so Tony Stein was buried at Calvary Cemetery in Dayton according to his widow's wishes, despite his mother's protests. The funeral service was held at Our Lady of Rosary Church on December 17, 1948, with full military honors and a large attendance of Dayton residents who wanted to pay respects to their hometown hero. Tony's mother attended but did not speak, carrying her grief and frustration silently, having lost her son twice, once to the war and once to a bureaucratic decision that prevented her from honoring him according to the faith of his ancestors. He rests there still, a Jewish Marine who converted to Catholicism to marry a woman he barely had time to know before a Japanese sniper ended his life on a volcanic rock in the Pacific. The legacy of Tony Stein extends beyond his individual heroism to include the weapon he helped create and the broader pattern of improvisation and innovation that characterized the American military during World War II. The Stinger was never officially adopted as a standard weapon because the war ended before formal procurement processes could evaluate it, and all 6 of the original Stingers have been lost to history, probably destroyed or discarded as battlefield debris, though one was reportedly used by Marines other than Tony for some time before disappearing. Modern weapons museums and collectors would value an original Stinger immensely, but none have surfaced, leaving the weapon as primarily a story rather than a surviving artifact. In 1972, the United States Navy commissioned USS Stein, a Knox-class frigate designated FF-1065, named in Tony's honor. The ship served for 20 years, participating in various operations during the Cold War before being decommissioned in 1992. Naming a warship after a fallen hero is the Navy's way of ensuring that sacrifice isn't forgotten, that names endure beyond individual lives, that each generation of sailors understands they serve in a tradition built on the courage of men like Tony Stein. The ship is gone now, scrapped like most decommissioned vessels, but the name remains in naval records, a permanent marker of one Marine's contribution to American victory. The Marine Corps dedicated the Moving Target Simulator building at Camp Pendleton's 3rd Low Altitude Air Defense Battalion in 1989, naming it after Tony Stein and ensuring that Marines training there would know about the corporal who built a weapon from spare parts and used it to save lives on Iwo Jima. These institutional commemorations serve important functions beyond simple memorial, creating teaching moments where Tony's story can be told to new generations of Marines, where his example of courage and innovation can inspire others facing their own challenges and decisions. Tony Stein's story raises questions about the nature of heroism and the relationship between technological innovation and combat effectiveness. He was heroic, not because he had superhuman abilities, but because he used the abilities he had with maximum effectiveness despite extreme danger. Because he made the choice to keep fighting when he could have stayed safe. Because he put other people's lives ahead of his own survival. His tool-making skills and mechanical knowledge allowed him to contribute to creating a weapon that gave him tactical advantages. But the weapon didn't make him heroic. His choices made him heroic. The weapon was just a tool. What mattered was what he chose to do with it. The contrast between Tony's background and his service illustrates the American military tradition of drawing strength from diversity, of taking people from different backgrounds and forging them into cohesive units through shared training and shared purpose. Tony was a Jewish kid whose parents fled European anti-Semitism, who grew up in working-class Dayton learning a trade, who had no particular military background or family tradition of service. He became a Marine because he chose to become a Marine. He became a hero because he chose to act heroically when circumstances demanded it. His story is distinctly American in that way, reflecting the nation's capacity to integrate people from anywhere and everywhere into something larger than their individual origins. The 8 ammunition runs he made while carrying wounded Marines represent a particular kind of heroism that goes beyond simply fighting the enemy. He could have made those runs without helping wounded men. His combat effectiveness didn't depend on it, but he saw people who needed help, and he helped them while simultaneously accomplishing his primary mission, refusing to see those as separate obligations, integrating compassion and lethality into a single coherent response to the situation he faced. That integration is what separated exceptional Marines from merely competent ones, what distinguished men who deserved the Medal of Honor from men who simply did their jobs adequately. Tony Stein's death at 23 means we never learned what he might have become if he had survived the war. He might have returned to tool-making in Dayton. He might have started his own machine shop. He might have become an engineer or an inventor. He might have had children and grandchildren who would carry his story forward. All of that potential ended on March 1st, 1945, when a Japanese sniper fired the bullet that killed him. The tragedy isn't just that he died, but that he died so young, having barely begun adult life, having experienced so little of what existence offers beyond combat and death. But that tragedy is also what makes his sacrifice meaningful. He gave up everything so others could live. That's what the Medal of Honor recognizes. That's what his name on ships and buildings commemorates. That's what we remember when we tell his story. The other 5 Stingers that Mel Grevich built also saw action on Iwo Jima, distributed among the rifle platoons and demolition section of G Company, where they provided the same devastating firepower that Tony used with such deadly effectiveness. The Marines who carried these weapons faced the same challenges Tony encountered. Extreme ammunition consumption requiring constant resupply, the physical burden of carrying a weapon that weighed more than standard infantry arms, and the attention that the distinctive sound drew from Japanese defenders who quickly learned that the Marine with the incredibly fast machine gun was a priority target. Not all of them survived. Some were killed before the battle ended. Others were wounded and evacuated. The weapons themselves disappeared into the chaos of combat, lost when their carriers were hit, abandoned when they jammed or broke, possibly thrown aside when ammunition ran out and Marines needed to arm themselves with whatever they could scavenge from the battlefield. Mel Grevich survived Iwo Jima and the war, returning to civilian life carrying the knowledge that he had created a weapon that saved Marine lives, that his innovation had given his fellow Marines a tactical advantage that helped them survive one of the bloodiest battles in American history. He never sought publicity for his creation, never tried to profit from the Stinger's fame, never claimed credit beyond what was documented in official records. Like many combat veterans, he preferred to let his service speak for itself, rather than drawing attention to his contributions. The fact that his name is less well known than Tony Stein's reflects the reality that individual heroic action captures public attention more effectively than engineering innovation, that people remember the warrior more readily than they remember the armorer who gave the warrior his weapon. The technical specifications of the Stinger reveal both its advantages and its limitations as a combat weapon. The M2 aircraft machine gun that formed the basis of the weapon was designed for aerial combat, where weight considerations were less important than rate of fire, where ammunition could be stored in large quantities in an aircraft's fuselage, where barrel overheating was mitigated by airflow at high speeds. Adapting it for ground use required compromises that Grevich managed skillfully, but that created inherent challenges. The high rate of fire that made the Stinger so deadly also created tremendous barrel heat during sustained firing, requiring careful fire discipline to prevent barrel damage. The modified trigger mechanism worked reliably, but added complexity that increased the potential for mechanical failure. The weight of the weapon plus ammunition exceeded what an average Marine could comfortably carry during an amphibious assault across volcanic sand. Tony Stein could handle these challenges because of his physical strength, his mechanical knowledge that allowed him to maintain and repair the weapon in field conditions, and his tactical intelligence that told him when to fire and when to conserve ammunition. A less capable Marine might have found the Stinger more burden than benefit, might have been slowed by its weight, might have wasted ammunition through poor fire discipline, might have been unable to fix mechanical problems that occurred during combat. The weapon and the man worked together, each enhancing the other's capabilities, creating a combination more effective than either element alone. The Marine Corps has a long tradition of field improvisation and modification, allowing individual Marines and small units to adapt their equipment to specific tactical situations, rather than requiring strict adherence to standardized configurations. This tradition recognizes that combat situations vary enormously, and that one-size-fits-all solutions often fail to address local conditions effectively. The Stinger represents an extreme example of this tradition, a weapon built entirely from salvaged parts without official authorization or support. But it exists along a continuum that includes countless smaller modifications Marines have made to their equipment throughout the Corps' history. Modern Marines carry gear that has been customized, modified, and adapted based on lessons learned from previous deployments, continuing the same process of innovation that Grevich and Stein demonstrated at Camp Pendleton in 1944. The question of whether the Stinger could have been mass-produced and issued as standard equipment if the war had continued longer is interesting but ultimately unanswerable. The weapon's advantages were clear: unprecedented rate of fire for a man-portable weapon, devastating effectiveness against fortified positions, psychological impact on enemy forces who had never encountered such firepower. But the disadvantages were equally clear: extreme ammunition consumption that would strain logistics, weight that reduced tactical mobility, complexity that required skilled armorers to maintain, and the basic reality that aircraft machine guns were needed for aircraft, rather than being available for ground use conversion. The military procurement system would have had to evaluate these trade-offs and determine whether the Stinger's benefits justified the costs and complications of formal adoption. The fact that all 6 original Stingers have been lost represents a significant gap in material culture preservation. Museums that specialize in military firearms would treasure an original Stinger, using it to teach visitors about wartime innovation and the role of individual initiative in combat effectiveness. Collectors who focus on unusual or improvised weapons would consider an original Stinger one of the holy grails of their field, a weapon that exists primarily as story rather than artifact. The absence of surviving examples means that our understanding of the Stinger depends on period photographs, written descriptions, and the testimony of men who saw it used, all of which are valuable but incomplete compared to the understanding that comes from examining an actual weapon. In 2013, a modern gunsmith named Paul Schull built a fully functional replica of the Stinger for a Canadian television show called The Weapon Hunter, using an original M2 aircraft machine gun from the Canadian Historical Arms Museum and modifying it according to specifications derived from historical research and period photographs. The process took 3 months and required considerable expertise in gunsmithing and machining, to recreate the modifications Grevich had made 7 decades earlier. Schul test-fired the replica on camera, demonstrating the weapon's incredible rate of fire by destroying sandbag emplacements representing Japanese fortifications, giving modern audiences a sense of what Marines on Iwo Jima experienced when Tony Stein opened fire with his Stinger. The replica remains in the Canadian Historical Arms Museum's collection, available for study and occasional demonstration. Another replica was built for the 2006 film Flags of Our Fathers, directed by Clint Eastwood and based on the book by James Bradley about the Marines who raised the flag on Mount Suribachi. The film's production team wanted to include the Stinger in scenes depicting the battle, recognizing that Tony Stein's story and his unusual weapon were important elements of the Iwo Jima narrative. The replica was built by Gietta Manufacturing Inc., a company specializing in creating accurate military props for films, and was used during filming, though the specific scenes featuring the Stinger were ultimately cut from the final release version of the movie. The replica's current location and status are unknown, possibly remaining in Gietta Manufacturing's inventory or possibly sold to a collector after filming concluded. Tony Stein's service as a Jewish-American Marine during World War II connects to the broader story of American Jewish military participation during the war against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Approximately 550,000 American Jews served in the U.S. military during World War II, roughly 11% of the total American Jewish population at the time, a percentage higher than the general population's military participation rate. They served in all branches and all theaters, fighting in Europe where they helped defeat the Nazi regime that was systematically murdering European Jews, and fighting in the Pacific where they contributed to the defeat of Japanese imperialism. Tony Stein was one of 36 Jewish Americans who received the Medal of Honor during World War II, and he was the only Jewish recipient from Iwo Jima. The fact that Tony converted to Catholicism before marrying reflects the social pressures that existed in mid-20th century America regarding interfaith marriage, pressures that led many Jewish Americans to assimilate by converting to Christianity when marrying outside their faith. Tony's parents had fled Europe partially to escape anti-Semitism, but they found their son felt compelled to abandon his Jewish identity to marry the woman he loved, suggesting that even in America, being Jewish created social obstacles that conversion could eliminate. The post-war conflict between his widow and his mother over burial location brought this religious complexity into sharp focus, with his widow insisting on Catholic burial, honoring his conversion, while his mother wanted Jewish burial, honoring his heritage. The fact that the widow prevailed meant Tony was buried in a Catholic cemetery despite being born and raised Jewish, creating a memorial that reflects his adult choices rather than his childhood identity. The broader context of Tony Stein's service includes the transformation of the U.S. Marine Corps during World War II from a relatively small force of approximately 54,000 Marines in 1940 to a massive organization of nearly 475,000 Marines by 1945. This expansion required rapid recruitment, training, and deployment of hundreds of thousands of new Marines, creating a force that blended pre-war professionals like drill instructors and senior NCOs with wartime volunteers like Tony, who had no military background before enlisting. The quality of this rapidly expanded force was maintained through intensive training, strong unit cohesion, and the Marine Corps culture that emphasized pride, tradition, and the expectation that Marines would perform at higher standards than other military services. The Pacific Island hopping campaign that culminated at Iwo Jima involved a series of amphibious assaults on increasingly well-defended Japanese-held islands, each battle teaching lessons that were incorporated into training and tactics for subsequent operations. By the time the Marines landed on Iwo Jima, they had experience from Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and numerous other battles, understanding what worked and what failed when attacking fortified positions defended by troops committed to fighting to the death. This accumulated knowledge informed the training Tony received at Camp Pendleton and shaped the tactics his unit employed on Iwo Jima, though no amount of training could fully prepare Marines for the reality of combat against an enemy who had months to prepare defenses and who fought with suicidal determination. The aftermath of Iwo Jima included debates about whether capturing the island had been worth the cost in American casualties. with some historians arguing that the strategic benefits didn't justify the losses, while others maintained that the airfield saved thousands of B-29 crew lives and contributed significantly to the air campaign against Japan. The Marines who fought there didn't engage in these strategic debates. They went where they were sent and did what they were ordered to do, trusting that higher command had valid reasons for requiring them to assault a heavily defended island. Tony Stein didn't question whether Iwo Jima was strategically necessary. He understood his mission was to attack Japanese positions, and he did that with maximum effectiveness using the weapon he had helped create, fighting not for strategic abstractions, but for the Marines beside him, whose survival depended on destroying enemy positions before those positions killed more Marines. The human cost of Tony Stein's heroism includes not just his own death, but the grief experienced by everyone who loved him. His widow, who had barely begun married life before becoming a widow. His mother, who had fled Europe to give her son opportunities in America, only to lose him in the Pacific. His father, who saw his son go to war and never return. And the friends who knew him as Tony, the toolmaker from Dayton, before he became Corporal Stein, the Medal of Honor recipient. Each of these people carried their own version of loss and grief, their own memories of who Tony was before the war, their own understanding of what his death meant. The Medal of Honor honored Tony's service, but it couldn't compensate his loved ones for their loss. No medal can do that. Recognition and compensation are fundamentally different things. The preservation of Tony Stein's memory through institutional commemorations like the named ship and the named building at Camp Pendleton serves the practical purpose of ensuring future generations of Marines know about the corporal who built a weapon from spare parts and used it with devastating effectiveness on Iwo Jima, providing an example of innovation, courage, and sacrifice that remains relevant regardless of changes in technology or tactics. These commemorations also serve the symbolic purpose of demonstrating that the Marine Corps remembers its heroes, that service and sacrifice are recognized and honored, that individual Marines matter beyond their contributions to mission success. Both functions are important for maintaining the Corps' institutional culture and for connecting current Marines to the tradition they inherit from previous generations. Tony Stein's story endures because it combines multiple elements that resonate across time. Technological innovation, driven by tactical necessity, individual heroism in the face of extreme danger, sacrifice that saved others' lives, and the tragedy of young death in service of larger purposes. These themes appear throughout military history in various forms, but Tony's story presents them with particular clarity and dramatic power, making it memorable and meaningful in ways that more typical combat narratives might not achieve. The image of a young toolmaker building a weapon from aircraft parts, then using that weapon to attack enemy fortifications while running barefoot across volcanic sand under fire while carrying wounded Marines, captures something essential about American military culture and American character that transcends the specific historical circumstances of World War II and Iwo Jima.